The baying of bloodhounds cut through the Wyoming night like a death knell growing closer with each thundering heartbeat. Elizabeth Morgan stumbled through the sagebrush, her white wedding dress shredding on thorns that tore at the delicate silk like grasping claws. Behind her, a dozen torches bobbed through the darkness, dancing flames carried by men who would drag her back to Judge Blackwood's bed, where his yellowed hands would claim what he'd paid for. The memory of his whispered threat from 3 hours earlier scorched through her mind. "Tomorrow night you'll learn what happens to disobedient wives. I'll break you proper, girl, same as I did the last two." His breath had reeked of whiskey and cruelty as he'd cornered her in the ranch house pantry, his fingers leaving bruises on her wrists that still throbbed with each desperate step. Her bare feet found treacherous purchase on the rocky ground as she pressed against a boulder, the stolen rifle trembling in her hands. Elizabeth had learned to shoot from her father during happy summers in Massachusetts, but she'd never imagined pointing a weapon at another human being. Tonight had changed everything. Tonight, she'd chosen death over degradation. "Trail's gone cold here, boys." Marshal Crawford's voice carried across the canyon walls. "Clever little whore, but she can't run forever." "Judge Blackwood wants her back breathing," another voice called out. He didn't say nothing about her being whole. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her grandmother's locket, the only piece of her former life she'd managed to grab before climbing through her bedroom window. The gold felt warm against her palm, a talisman from a world where women like her grandmother had fought their own battles against men who saw them as property. She would rather die free in this wilderness than live as Blackwood's prisoner, no matter how gilded the cage. Through the darkness above, she glimpsed a lone rider silhouetted against the star-drunk sky. He sat his horse with predatory stillness, watching the chaos below with an alien grace that spoke of lives lived beyond the reach of white man's law. For a heartbeat, she feared he was another hunter, but something in his bearing, the way he moved like wind over water, told her this was no pursuer sent by her uncle. As dawn broke gray and merciless over the Badlands, Elizabeth had lost the sounds of pursuit hours ago. Her wedding dress hung in tatters, more ghost than garment, and her feet were bloody inside slippers, meant for dancing on polished floors, not fleeing across 30 miles of unforgiving stone. But she breathed free air for the first time in months, and that was worth any price. She had been 17 when the telegram arrived that shattered her world. Her parents, traveling to Denver on business, had perished when their stagecoach plunged into a flash-swollen river. In one brutal moment, she'd lost not just her mother and father, but her entire future. The family estate in Massachusetts was sold to pay debts she'd never known existed, and she found herself shipped west like cargo to live with Uncle Samuel, a man whose only connection to her father had been increasingly desperate letters demanding loans. Samuel Morgan embodied everything her gentle father had despised: violence, greed, and the cold calculation of a man who saw other humans as resources to be exploited. He'd carved out his Wyoming territory through intimidation and brutality, claiming land that had belonged to the Cheyenne for countless generations. The Native Americans had been driven to reservations, but their presence still haunted the valley in the ancient stones and wind-carved trails that spiderwebbed across the property. "You're a beautiful girl, Elizabeth." Samuel had told her on that first terrible morning at the ranch, his pale eyes crawling over her like grave worms. "Beauty's hard currency out here, same as gold or cattle. Spend it wise and you'll live comfortable. Waste it and you'll be dead before winter." She'd learned to avoid his attention, to move through the house like a shadow. The ranch hands were rough men who treated women as they did their horses, useful animals to be broken and used. Only Maria, the Mexican cook, had shown her kindness, teaching her Spanish and sharing stories of a homeland where women could be warriors as well as mothers. But Samuel had been planning her future from the moment she'd stepped off the stagecoach. Judge Cornelius Blackwood was 65 years old, a territorial judge with political ambitions and a reputation for cruelty that stretched far beyond his courtroom. He'd buried 2 wives already, both young, both beautiful, both dead before their 25th birthdays, under circumstances that raised whispers, but never charges. He's offering to clear the ranch's debts. Samuel had explained when he announced the engagement like a business transaction. Substantial debts, Elizabeth. All you need to do is be a good wife and give him sons. It's more than generous. Elizabeth had met Blackwood twice before last night's attempted wedding. The first time he'd examined her like a horse trader evaluating breeding stock, commenting on her bone structure and making her open her mouth to inspect her teeth. The second time he'd cornered her in the ranch library while Samuel conducted business outside. I have very particular expectations for my wives. He'd whispered, his breath hot against her ear as his hands wandered freely over her body. Complete submission, absolute gratitude, and proper appreciation for the privilege of bearing my name. My previous wives occasionally forgot their place. His fingers had tightened on her throat just enough to make breathing difficult. They won't make that mistake again. When Elizabeth had pulled away, he'd struck her hard enough to split her lip and leave her ears ringing. Spirited fillies need breaking, he'd told Samuel upon his return, wiping blood from his knuckles. But they're worth the effort once they learn their place. That night, alone in her room with her swollen lip throbbing, Elizabeth had made her choice. She'd listened to the ranch hands' conversations about the trails and the dangers lurking beyond the fence line. She knew the risks: starvation, exposure, wild animals, hostile Indians. But staying meant a slow death of everything that made her who she was. The escape had been simpler than she'd dared hope. While the house slept off the pre-wedding celebration, she'd slipped outside and made her way to the stables. Thunder, Samuel's prize stallion, was a spirited animal most of the hands avoided, but Elizabeth had inherited her father's way with horses. She'd saddled him in the darkness, her hands steady despite her hammering heart. She'd ridden hard for the first few miles, following an old Indian trail that led north toward the mountains. When pursuit came, the thunder of hoofbeats, the baying of Samuel's hunting dogs, the angry shouts of men denied their entertainment. She'd made a desperate gamble. Stripping off her riding jacket and tying it to a tree branch, she'd sent Thunder racing east while she continued north on foot. The deception had bought her precious hours, but she knew it wouldn't fool them for long. Now, as the sun climbed higher and heat began to shimmer off the rocks, Elizabeth forced herself to keep moving. Her stolen canteen was empty, her strength failing. But she could see the mountains in the distance, blue and promising. If she could reach the foothills, she might find water shelter, perhaps even a mining camp, where she could disappear into a new life. The land here was different from anything she'd known in Massachusetts. It was harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful in its own terrible way. The sky stretched forever, painted in shades of blue that seemed to go on beyond the edge of the world. The wind carried scents of sage and something wilder, more ancient. In the distance, she could hear the cry of a hawk riding the thermals free as she longed to be. She had been walking for hours when she saw him again, the rider from the ridge, closer now. He appeared on a paint horse like something from a fever dream, his long black hair braided with eagle feathers, his chest bare except for a bone breastplate that gleamed white against his bronze skin. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but his dark eyes held depth that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. Elizabeth's first instinct was to run, but her legs shook with exhaustion, and she knew she couldn't outpace a mounted rider. She'd heard the whispered stories of what happened to white women who fell into the hands of savages, tales of torture and worse that were used to justify the army's brutal campaigns. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something unexpected, not cruelty or lust, but curiosity, and perhaps even compassion. The rider was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His face was aristocratic with high cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by a thin scar that spoke of battles fought and survived. But it was his eyes that held her dark as obsidian holding depths that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You run from something," he said in accented English, his voice low and measured like distant thunder. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, surprised by her own honesty. He studied her torn dress, her bleeding feet, the exhaustion that made her sway like grass in wind. What makes a woman choose the wilderness over the comfort of her own people? The same thing that makes a man choose freedom over safety. Elizabeth answered, meeting his gaze steadily. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty in the universal gesture of peace. "I am Stone Wolf of the Northern Cheyenne. You are far from the settlements, white woman." "I have no people," Elizabeth said, and realized it was true. "I'm trying to reach the mountains. The mountains are far. You will not survive the journey as you are." He paused, his dark eyes studying her face with unsettling intensity. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me that courage calls to courage regardless of the skin that contains it." Before Elizabeth could respond, the world tilted around her. The lack of water, the exhaustion, the terror of the past night, it all crashed down at once like a mountain avalanche. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and she found herself looking up into Stone Wolf's concerned face, his features swimming in and out of focus. "Sleep now," he said gently, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "You are safe." Elizabeth's last conscious thought was that she was either about to die or discover what it meant to truly live. Either way, it was better than the hell waiting for her back at the ranch. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to set the world on fire. She lay on a soft buffalo robe beside a small fire, the smell of cooking meat making her stomach clench with desperate hunger. Stone Wolf sat across from her, tending the flames with a stick, his profile sharp against the dying light. "You slept through the day," he said without looking up. "Your body demanded rest." Elizabeth sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her battered feet. Someone had cleaned and bandaged her wounds, and she was wearing a simple deerskin dress instead of her ruined wedding gown. The unfamiliar weight of the garment felt strange against her skin, but also somehow right, as if she was shedding one identity and putting on another. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do not thank me yet." Stone Wolf replied, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I have brought you to my people's camp. Not all of them welcome white settlers with open arms." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Elizabeth's heart sank as she saw a group of Cheyenne warriors riding toward them, their faces painted for war, their eyes hard as flint. At their head was an older man, with silver streaking his hair, and scars crisscrossing his chest like a map of old battles. "Stone Wolf," the older man said in Cheyenne, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Why do you bring this white woman to our fire?" Stone Wolf rose smoothly, his own voice calm but firm, as he replied in the same language. Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tension in their bodies the way hands drifted toward weapons. The argument continued for several minutes, voices rising and falling like competing storms, while Elizabeth sat frozen by the fire, understanding that her life hung in the balance. Finally, Stone Wolf switched to English, his words clearly meant for her to hear. "My uncle Running Bear believes you are a spy sent by the white soldiers to learn our ways. He thinks I am a fool for trusting you." "I'm not a spy," Elizabeth said, rising to her feet despite the pain. "I'm just a woman trying to escape a terrible fate." Running Bear's eyes narrowed as he studied her, taking in her torn hands, her frightened face, the way she held herself like a cornered animal. "All white women say this when they are caught," he said in heavily accented English. "You dress like us now, but your heart remains white. You will betray us when it serves your purpose." "I have nothing to betray you to." Elizabeth replied, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm an outcast from my own people. They would kill me before they would listen to anything I said. Then you are of no use to us, Running Bear said coldly. We should leave you for the wolves and coyotes. Uncle Stone Wolf said, his voice carrying a warning that made the air itself seem to vibrate. She is under my protection. Your protection. Running Bear laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You are not yet a chief nephew. You do not have the right to make such decisions for the people. Then I claim that right as a warrior proven in battle? Stone Wolf replied, his hand moving to rest on his knife hilt. This woman seeks sanctuary, and I will provide it. The two men stared at each other across the fire, the tension so thick Elizabeth could taste it on her tongue. Finally, Running Bear nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. Very well. But when she betrays us, and she will, her blood will be on your hands. He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the camp, his warriors following like a pack of wolves. Stone Wolf watched them go, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Will there be trouble? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There is always trouble, Stone Wolf replied. The question is whether it will be the kind that kills us or the kind that makes us stronger. Over the following days, Elizabeth learned what it meant to live as Cheyenne. The camp was a collection of teepees arranged in a sacred circle, each one home to a family or group of warriors. The people were suspicious at first, watching her with eyes that held generations of betrayal and broken promises. But slowly she began to earn their grudging respect. She helped the women with their daily tasks, learning to tan hides and weave grass into baskets. She tended the sick and injured using herbal knowledge learned from her mother and Maria. But it was her actions during a crisis that truly earned her place among them. Swift Arrow, the 8-year-old son of Gray Hawk, one of the camp's most respected warriors, was brought to the camp convulsing and near death from a rattlesnake bite. The boy had been playing near the river when the snake struck, and by the time he was found, the venom was already racing through his small body. Elizabeth acted without thinking, drawing on everything her father had taught her about treating animal bites during their hunting trips. She sucked the venom from the wound, spitting out the poison until her mouth burned, then applied a poultice of herbs she had seen growing nearby. She stayed by the boy's side for 3 days and nights, monitoring his breathing and pulse, forcing water between his lips when he could swallow, and holding his hand when fever made him cry out in his sleep. When Swift Arrow finally opened his eyes on the 4th morning and asked for his mother, the camp erupted in celebration. Gray Hawk, a stern warrior who rarely showed emotion, approached Elizabeth with tears streaming down his weathered face. "You have given me back my son," he said in broken English, his voice thick with emotion. "My life is yours if you have need of it." "I only did what anyone would do," Elizabeth replied, embarrassed by the attention. "No," Greyhawk said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did what family would do. You are no longer a stranger among us." Stone Wolf had been watching from the crowd, and when their eyes met, Elizabeth saw something new in his expression. Pride, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race like a wild thing in her chest. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Stone Wolf approached her teepee. "Walk with me," he said softly. They walked in comfortable silence to the edge of the camp, where the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Elizabeth had never seen the night sky so clearly. No city lights, no smoke from factories, just the pure darkness of the frontier, punctuated by points of light that seemed close enough to touch. "You saved that boy's life," Stone Wolf said finally. "I helped him," Elizabeth corrected. "He was strong. He would have fought through it." "Perhaps. But you didn't know that when you acted." He paused, studying her face in the starlight. "Why did you really run, Elizabeth? What frightened you so much?" that you chose almost certain death over the life that was planned for you. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, and the memory of Blackwood's hands and whispered threats making her skin crawl. I was to be married to a man who would have destroyed me, she said finally. He was evil, truly evil, and my uncle sold me to him like a piece of livestock. This is the way of your people. It's the way of some of my people, Elizabeth replied. Just as there are good and bad among the Cheyenne. Unfortunately, the bad ones often have the most power. Stonewolf nodded slowly. My people have been driven from our lands by men who speak of law and justice, but practice only greed and violence. We fight for our survival, but we are outnumbered and outgunned. Each day our world grows smaller. Is that why you helped me? Because you saw a fellow refugee? Perhaps, Stonewolf said. Or perhaps I saw something else. What? He turned to face her, and in the starlight, she could see the intensity burning in his dark eyes. I saw a woman who would rather die free than live as a slave. That takes a special kind of courage. Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. And what do you see now? Now I see a woman who has found her strength. Stonewolf replied, a woman who belongs not to any man, but to herself. They stood close together in the darkness, the wind carrying the scent of sage, and something wilder, more primal. Elizabeth could feel the warmth radiating from Stonewolf's body, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. She had never been so close to a man without fear, without the expectation of violence or violation. Stonewolf, she said softly. Yes, thank you. For giving me the chance to discover who I really am. He reached out and touched her face with gentle fingers, tracing the line of her jaw with heartbreaking tenderness. You are discovering who you have always been, Elizabeth. The cage did not change you. It only hid your true nature from the world. When he kissed her, it was nothing like Blackwood's brutal assault. This was gentle questioning, a request rather than a demand. Elizabeth found herself responding, her arms coming up to circle his neck, her body melting against his, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Stonewolf rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. This is dangerous, he said quietly. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Elizabeth replied. My people will not understand. Your people will call you a traitor. Then perhaps it's time to stop caring what other people think. Stonewolf smiled, and Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. You are a dangerous woman, Elizabeth Morgan. I certainly hope so. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth found herself falling deeper in love with both Stonewolf and the life she was building among the Cheyenne. She learned to ride like a warrior, to track game across seemingly empty land, to read the signs of weather and seasons in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. She was becoming someone new, not the frightened girl who had fled into the wilderness, but a woman who knew her own mind and her own heart. But even as she grew stronger and more confident, the world beyond the camp was growing more dangerous. Riders had been seen on the horizon, and scouts brought back reports of soldiers gathering at Fort Laramie. The pressure was building like a storm front, and Elizabeth could feel it in the way the warriors spoke in hushed tones, in the way the women watched the horizon with worried eyes. Stonewolf had been chosen as the new war chief, a position that carried enormous responsibility in these dangerous times. He led hunting parties farther and farther from the camp, trying to find game that hadn't been driven away by the expanding settlements. The buffalo were disappearing, and the people were beginning to go hungry. We cannot continue like this, he told Elizabeth one evening as they sat by their fire, his face etched with worry. My people are proud, but pride doesn't fill empty bellies or stop bullets. What will you do? I don't know, Stonewolf admitted, and the confession seemed to age him years in the span of seconds. Every choice seems to lead to death. Death by starvation, death by disease on the reservation, death by the soldiers' bullets. Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a war that's already lost. Elizabeth took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses from years of hard work and harder choices. You're not fighting for victory, she said firmly. You're fighting for the right to exist as yourselves. That's never a lost cause. You sound like my grandmother, Stone Wolf said with a sad smile. She used to say that as long as one Cheyenne drew breath, the people would never truly die. She was wise. She was. She also said that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unexpected places. He looked at Elizabeth meaningfully. She would have liked you. I wish I could have met her. In a way you have, Stone Wolf said. Her spirit lives on in the kindness you show to our children, in the medicine you practice, in the way you have embraced our ways without losing yourself. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. I've never felt like I belonged anywhere before. Not really. You belong here, Stone Wolf said firmly. You belong with me. But even as he spoke the words, Elizabeth could see the doubt in his eyes. The world was changing, and their bubble of happiness was growing more fragile with each passing day. She could feel it in the restless energy of the camp, in the way conversation stopped when she approached, in the increasing frequency of war councils that excluded her. The crisis came on a crisp autumn morning, when a lone rider approached the camp at full gallop. Elizabeth was helping the women prepare the morning meal when she heard the commotion. A young warrior had ridden his horse nearly to death to bring news from the south. Soldiers, he gasped, sliding from his exhausted mount. A full company, maybe more. They're moving this way with civilian volunteers. Stone Wolf emerged from his teepee, his face grim as winter. How long? 2 days, maybe 3 if they stop to rest their horses. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women began packing their belongings while men gathered weapons and checked their horses. Elizabeth found herself caught in the middle of the activity, unsure of what to do or where to go. Elizabeth. Stone Wolf's voice cut through the noise. Come with me. He led her to a secluded spot behind the camp where a grove of cottonwoods provided some privacy. His expression was more serious than she had ever seen it, and she felt a chill of premonition. You need to leave, he said without preamble. What? Elizabeth felt as if she had been struck. I won't leave you. You must. If the soldiers find you here, they'll assume you were taken captive. They'll use that as an excuse to justify whatever they do to my people. I won't let them hurt you. Stone Wolf gripped her shoulders, his eyes desperate. Listen to me. There are forces at work here that go beyond soldiers and Indians. Your uncle has been talking to people in Washington, telling them that the Cheyenne are a threat to the settlers. If they find you here, then I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell them that I came here willingly, that you saved my life. They won't believe you. They'll say you've been driven mad by captivity, that you don't know what you're saying. Stone Wolf's voice was urgent now, almost pleading. Elizabeth, please. Go to the fort. Tell them you escaped. Make up a story. But don't let them find you here. Elizabeth stared at him, feeling the world tilt around her. Are you sending me away? I'm trying to save your life. What about your life? What about the life we've built together? Stone Wolf's face crumpled with pain. That life was always borrowed time. We both knew it couldn't last forever. I don't accept that. Elizabeth's voice was fierce with determination. I won't accept that. You have to. No. Elizabeth stepped back, her hands clenched into fists. I won't run again. I won't let them win. Elizabeth, I love you, she said simply. I love you, and I love these people, and I won't abandon them when they need me most. Stone Wolf stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, admiration, and fear. Finally, he nodded slowly. Then we face whatever comes together. Together, Elizabeth agreed. But as they walked back to the camp, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward their doom. The soldiers were coming, and with them, the end of everything she had found here. She touched her grandmother's locket, the one piece of her old life that she had carried into the new, and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. The attack came not at dawn, as Elizabeth had expected, but in the gray hour before sunrise, when the camp was still wrapped in the deep sleep of exhaustion. She woke to the sound of gunfire and screaming the acrid smell of gun smoke, mixing with the scent of burning canvas as the first teepees caught fire. Elizabeth stumbled from her lodge to find the camp in chaos. Women were fleeing with their children, while warriors fought desperately to hold back the attackers. Through the smoke and confusion, she caught sight of Stone Wolf rallying his men, his war cry echoing across the battlefield like the scream of an eagle. "But there she is." The voice made her blood run cold. She turned to see Marshal Crawford riding toward her, his face twisted with rage and triumph. "There's the little whore." Elizabeth ran, but Crawford's horse was faster. He leapt from the saddle and tackled her to the ground, his weight crushing the breath from her lungs. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the wild light in his eyes. "Did you think you could just disappear?" He snarled, his hands rough on her throat. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" "I don't know what you mean." Elizabeth gasped, trying to break free. "Don't lie to me." Crawford backhanded her across the face, splitting her lip. "You cost us a lot of trouble running off like that. Judge Blackwood's been very patient, but his patience is running out. I'd rather die than go back to him," Elizabeth said, tasting blood. "Now that can be arranged," Crawford said, drawing his pistol. "But first, you're going to watch me put a bullet in your savage lover's brain." Elizabeth's heart stopped as she saw Crawford taking aim at Stone Wolf, who was fighting 3 men at once and hadn't seen the marshal. Without thinking, she lunged forward, grabbing for the gun. The shot went wild, but the damage was done. Stone Wolf heard the gunfire and turned, his eyes widening as he saw Elizabeth struggling with Crawford. He abandoned his fight and rushed toward them, but he was too far away. Crawford struck Elizabeth with the butt of his pistol, sending her sprawling in the dirt. "You want to play with savages?" he snarled. "Then you can die like one." He raised the gun again, but this time it was Stone Wolf who threw himself forward. The 2 men crashed to the ground, grappling for control of the weapon. Elizabeth watched in horror as they rolled in the dirt, each trying to gain the advantage. The gun went off again, and both men went still. For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't tell who had been hit. Then Stone Wolf rolled away, clutching his shoulder, and she saw the spreading stain of blood on his shirt. Crawford was dead, his lifeless eyes staring at the sky. Stone Wolf struggled to his feet, swaying from blood loss and exhaustion. Around them, the battle was winding down. The volunteers had accomplished their mission, and they had scattered the camp, killed or captured most of the warriors, and driven the survivors into the wilderness. "Elizabeth," Stone Wolf said weakly, "are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. The world around them was a hellscape of smoke and blood, of burning teepees and weeping women. Everything they had built together was gone, destroyed in the space of minutes. "We have to go," Stone Wolf said, trying to gather his strength. "They'll regroup and come back." But even as he spoke, Elizabeth could see more riders approaching. These were real soldiers, and at their head rode a figure she recognized with a sinking heart. Judge Blackwood had come to collect his bride. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice water as she watched Judge Blackwood dismount from his horse with the careful movements of a man who had grown accustomed to having others do his physical work. He was exactly as she remembered, tall, silver-haired, with a kind of distinguished bearing that fooled people into thinking him a gentleman. But Elizabeth had seen the monster beneath the facade, and she knew that her nightmare was far from over. "My dear Miss Morgan," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the devastated camp with cruel satisfaction. "What a relief to find you safe and sound. When Marshal Crawford told me you had been taken by these people, I feared the worst. Stone Wolf stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth, despite his wounded shoulder. She was not taken, he said firmly. She came to us seeking sanctuary from your cruelty. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Stone Wolf, with the cold interest of a man examining a particularly interesting insect. Ah, the noble savage speaks. How quaint. He gestured to his soldiers. Arrest this man for kidnapping and assault on a white woman. I was not kidnapped, Elizabeth said, stepping forward. I came here of my own free will. My dear child, Blackwood said with false sympathy, you've obviously been traumatized by your ordeal. It's well documented that captives often develop confused feelings toward their captors. It's a form of madness, really. I'm not mad, Elizabeth said hotly. I know exactly what happened. I ran away because I refused to marry you, and Stone Wolf saved my life. Blackwood's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold rage beneath. Sergeant, he said to one of his men, please escort Miss Morgan to safety. She's clearly in shock. I'm not going anywhere with you, Elizabeth said, backing away. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Blackwood replied smoothly. As your legal guardian, your uncle has given me full authority over your welfare. You will come with me, and you will be grateful for my patience and understanding. My uncle has no authority over me, Elizabeth said desperately. I'm 18 years old. I can make my own decisions. Not according to territorial law, Blackwood said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. An unmarried woman cannot make legal decisions without the consent of her male guardian. That's me now. Elizabeth felt the trap closing around her once again. She had been so focused on the immediate danger that she had forgotten the legal realities of her situation. In the eyes of the law, she was still property, still a thing to be owned and controlled. However, Blackwood continued, I am not an unreasonable man. I'm willing to overlook your adventure if you come quietly and agree to honor our engagement. We can be married as soon as we return to Fort Laramie. And if I refuse, Blackwood's smile widened like a crack in ice. Then I'll have no choice but to charge your savage friend here with kidnapping, rape, and corruption of a white woman. The penalty for such crimes is, of course, death. Elizabeth felt the world spin around her. It was the same trap, the same impossible choice: submit to Blackwood's will or watch Stone Wolf die for crimes he hadn't committed. She looked at Stone Wolf, seeing the resignation in his eyes. He knew, as she did, that they were beaten. There is, however, a third option. Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Elizabeth could hear. I could simply have him shot while trying to escape. It would be much cleaner, and it would save the territory the expense of a trial. You bastard, Elizabeth breathed. I'm a practical man, Blackwood replied. I get what I want one way or another. The question is how much suffering you're willing to cause in the process. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her. She had fought so hard for her freedom, had found love and purpose among the Cheyenne, only to have it all stripped away by the very system she had tried to escape. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, Blackwood said magnanimously. You have until morning. I suggest you use it wisely. That night, Elizabeth sat beside Stone Wolf in the makeshift prison the soldiers had constructed from wagon wheels and rope. His wound had been bandaged, but he was still weak from blood loss. Around them, the few surviving members of the camp huddled together, their faces blank with shock and grief. You have to go with him, Stone Wolf said quietly. I can't, Elizabeth replied. I won't. If you don't, he'll kill me, and probably half the people in this camp. You know this. Elizabeth did know it. She had seen the cold calculation in Blackwood's eyes, the way he weighed human lives against his own desires. He would massacre everyone here without a second thought if it served his purposes. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Stone Wolf took her hand in his thumb tracing patterns on her knuckles. "Sometimes there is no other way. Sometimes the only choice is which sacrifice to make. I won't sacrifice you. You're not sacrificing me," Stone Wolf said firmly. "You're saving my people. You're saving the children, the women, and the elders who have done nothing wrong. That's the choice of a true warrior." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to be a warrior. I just want to be with you." "I know," Stone Wolf said softly. "But sometimes what we want and what we must do are different things. My grandmother used to say that the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices." They sat in silence for a long moment, holding each other in the darkness. Elizabeth tried to memorize everything about this moment, the warmth of Stone Wolf's body against hers, the sound of his breathing, the way his hair felt beneath her fingers. "If I do this," she said finally, "will you promise me something? Anything. Don't let them break you. Don't let them turn you into something you're not. Stay true to who you are, no matter what happens." Stone Wolf cupped her face in his hands, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "I promise. But you must promise me the same thing." "I don't know if I can." "You're stronger than you think," Stone Wolf said. "You've already survived one cage. You can survive another. Not without you. You'll find a way," Stone Wolf said. "And when you do, I'll be waiting." They kissed then, desperately, knowing it might be their last. Elizabeth poured all her love, all her fear, all her hope into that kiss, trying to say goodbye to the only man who had ever seen her as more than property. When morning came, Elizabeth stood before Judge Blackwood with her shoulders straight and her head held high. She was wearing the torn wedding dress she had arrived in, now cleaned and mended as best as possible. It seemed fitting, a symbol of everything she was giving up. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I knew you would see reason," Blackwood said with satisfaction. "And your savage friend, let him go. Let them all go." "Of course," Blackwood said smoothly. "I'm a man of my word." But Elizabeth could see the lie in his eyes, and she knew Stone Wolf could see it too. This was just the beginning of a larger game, one that would end in blood and betrayal, no matter what choices they made. As the soldiers prepared to escort Elizabeth away, she turned back to Stone Wolf one last time. He was standing proud despite his chains, his dark eyes holding hers across the distance. She pressed her hand to her heart, then to her lips, then extended it toward him, a gesture of love that transcended words. Stone Wolf nodded once, his own hand moving to touch the medicine pouch at his throat. Inside, Elizabeth knew was a lock of her hair that she had given him weeks ago. It was all they would have left of each other now. "A time to go." Blackwood set his hand closing around Elizabeth's arm with possessive force. As they rode away from the camp, Elizabeth didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the devastation they were leaving behind, the lives destroyed by forces beyond their control. But she carried the memory of Stone Wolf's face with her and the promise they had made to each other. She would find a way to survive. She would find a way to be free. And somehow, someday, she would make Blackwood pay for what he had done. The journey back to Fort Laramie took 3 days, 3 days during which Elizabeth learned the true extent of Blackwood's cruelty. He made no attempt to hide his nature now that he had her in his power. He spoke casually of the Indian problem and how it needed to be solved permanently. He described his plans for their marriage with clinical detachment, as if she were a prize horse he was planning to breed. "You'll give me strong sons," he said on the second night, his eyes roaming over her body with disgusting familiarity. "Boys who can carry on the Blackwood name and political dynasty." Of course, I'll need to break you of your willful habits first. I'm not an animal to be broken, Elizabeth said quietly. No, Blackwood agreed. You're a woman. In many ways, that's much the same thing. Elizabeth said nothing, but she filed away every word, every gesture, every casual cruelty. She was building a case against him in her mind, gathering evidence of his true nature. She didn't know how she would use it yet, but she was certain the opportunity would come. When they finally reached Fort Laramie, Elizabeth was shocked by what she found. The fort was buzzing with activity. Soldiers, politicians, and businessmen all gathered for what appeared to be some kind of celebration. Banners hung from the buildings, and she could hear music and laughter coming from the officers' quarters. "What's all this?" she asked. "A reception in our honor," Blackwood said with satisfaction. "News of your rescue has spread quickly. You're quite the celebrity, my dear, the brave white woman who survived months of captivity among the savages." Elizabeth felt sick. "I wasn't a captive. I was—" "You were confused," Blackwood interrupted. "Traumatized. It's perfectly understandable. But don't worry, I've arranged for the best medical care. Dr. Hartwell is an expert in female hysteria. He'll help you recover from your ordeal." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She had heard of Dr. Hartwell. He ran an asylum in Denver, a place where inconvenient women were sent to be cured of their independence. If Blackwood had her declared mentally incompetent, she would have no legal rights at all. "You can't do this," she said. "I can do whatever I want," Blackwood replied. "I'm a territorial judge, and you're my disturbed fiancé. Who's going to stop me?" As if in answer to his question, a familiar voice called out across the fort's courtyard, "Elizabeth, thank God you're safe." Elizabeth turned to see Mary Hutchinson running toward her, tears streaming down her face. Mary had been Elizabeth's closest friend back in Massachusetts, the daughter of her father's business partner. They had grown up together, shared secrets and dreams, and Elizabeth had mourned the loss of their friendship when she was sent west. "Mary." Elizabeth could hardly believe her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I came as soon as I heard what happened," Mary said, throwing her arms around Elizabeth. "Your uncle sent word that you had been taken by Indians. I was so afraid I'd never see you again." Elizabeth hugged her friend back, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. Mary was here, which meant she wasn't completely alone. Maybe she could find an ally in this nightmare. "How did you get here?" Elizabeth asked. "I took the train to Denver, then joined a wagon train heading north," Mary said. "It took weeks, but I had to come. I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering alone." But as Elizabeth looked more closely at her friend, she noticed something strange. Mary's clothes were too fine for someone who had just completed a grueling journey across the frontier. Her hands were too soft, her complexion too clear. And there was something in her eyes, a glitter of satisfaction, that made Elizabeth's stomach clench with sudden dread. Blackwood stepped forward with his politician's smile. "Miss Hutchinson, I presume I'm Judge Blackwood, Elizabeth's fiancé. I can't tell you how grateful I am that you've come. Elizabeth has been through quite an ordeal, and I'm sure she'll benefit from the companionship of a dear friend." Mary's eyes widened as she looked at Blackwood, but Elizabeth caught something else in her expression. Not surprise, but recognition. Fiancé, but Elizabeth never mentioned it was arranged while she was away, Blackwood said smoothly. Her uncle felt it was best given the circumstances. She needs a strong man to protect her and help her recover from her trauma. Elizabeth saw Mary's smile falter for just a moment, then return brighter than before. "Of course. I'm sure you'll take excellent care of her." "I intend to," Blackwood said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to get Elizabeth settled. The wedding is tomorrow, and there's much to prepare." "Tomorrow?" Elizabeth said, her heart sinking. "But I saw no reason to delay." Blackwood said firmly. The sooner we're married, the sooner you can begin your recovery. As Blackwood led Elizabeth away, she caught Mary's eye and tried to communicate her desperation without words. But instead of the sympathy she expected, she saw something cold and calculating in her friend's expression, something that made her blood run cold. That night, Elizabeth was locked in a room in the fort's guest quarters, supposedly for her own protection. She paced the small space like a caged animal, her mind racing, as she tried to think of a way out. The window was barred, the door was locked, and there was a guard posted outside. She was trapped as surely as if she were in a prison cell. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Elizabeth, it's Mary. May I come in?" Elizabeth heard the key turn in the lock, and then Mary slipped inside, closing the door behind her. In the lamplight, Elizabeth could see that her friend's expression was no longer friendly. It was cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "What's really going on, Mary?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary smiled, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw the real woman beneath the mask of friendship. "Oh, Elizabeth, you always were too trusting, too naive, too special." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I didn't come here to rescue you," Mary said, settling into a chair with casual grace. "I came here to destroy you." Elizabeth felt the world tilt around her. "What? You see, my dear friend Judge Blackwood is a very generous man. He's offered to pay off my family's substantial debts that would have landed my father in prison in exchange for certain services." "You're working for him." "I'm working for myself," Mary corrected. "You always had everything, Elizabeth. The loving parents, the beautiful home, the freedom to choose your own path. Even when you lost all, that you still managed to find happiness. It's really quite unfair." Elizabeth stared at her childhood friend, seeing the jealousy and hatred that had been festering for years. "You're insane, perhaps," Mary said with a shrug. "But I'm also winning. Tomorrow you'll marry Judge Blackwood like a good little girl, and your savage lover will hang for kidnapping and corrupting a white woman. Stonewolf didn't kidnap me, you know that." "Oh, I know," Mary said with a laugh that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "But no one else does. In fact, I have some very interesting documents that prove your family's colorful heritage." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "What documents?" "Birth certificates, marriage records, family trees, all proving that your grandmother was half Cherokee. Which makes you part Indian, my dear. Imagine the scandal. The chapel was packed with dignitaries, soldiers, and local officials the next morning. Elizabeth felt like she was walking to her execution as Blackwood escorted her down the aisle in her white gown. She kept looking toward the back of the chapel, hoping against hope that somehow Stonewolf would appear to save her. The ceremony began with the usual pomp and circumstance. The preacher droned on about the sanctity of marriage and the duties of a wife, while Elizabeth stood frozen beside Blackwood, her mind numb with despair. "Do you, Cornelius Blackwood, take Elizabeth Morgan to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Blackwood said, his voice rich with satisfaction. "And do you, Elizabeth Morgan, take Cornelius Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked out at the congregation, at the faces of people who saw her as nothing more than a prize to be won. Then she looked at Blackwood, at the cold triumph in his eyes, as she began. "Stop!" Mary's voice rang out from the back of the chapel. "This wedding cannot proceed." All heads turned as Mary stood up, her face flushed with excitement. "I have evidence that this woman is not who she claims to be." Elizabeth stared at her friend in shock. This wasn't what they had discussed. This was something else entirely. "What is the meaning of this?" Blackwood demanded, but Elizabeth could see he was acting that this was all part of their plan. "I have documents proving that Miss Morgan's grandmother was half Cherokee. Mary said, walking down the aisle with a sheaf of papers. Which makes Elizabeth part Indian herself. The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her as she realized the full extent of Mary's betrayal. She wasn't just destroying Elizabeth's reputation, she was destroying her entire identity. "This is preposterous," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have the proof right here," Mary continued. "Birth certificates, marriage records, everything. Miss Morgan is not the pure white woman you thought you were marrying Judge Blackwood. She's part savage herself." Elizabeth finally found her voice. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "It's true." The simple words seemed to echo through the chapel like a gunshot. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "You deceiving bitch," he snarled, striking her across the face. "You made me look like a fool. I never lied to you," Elizabeth said, tasting blood from her split lip. "You never asked about my heritage. Get her out of my sight," Blackwood commanded his soldiers. "Lock her up. I'll deal with her later." As the soldiers moved to grab her, Elizabeth looked at Mary one last time. Her former friend was standing calmly in the midst of the chaos, watching Elizabeth's destruction with cold satisfaction. "Why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice cutting through the noise. Mary smiled. "Because you always thought you were better than everyone else. Well, now everyone knows what you really are." The soldiers dragged Elizabeth away, but she kept her eyes on Mary's face, memorizing every line of hatred and jealousy. She had been a fool to trust her, a fool to believe that anyone from her old life would truly help her. The cell they threw her into was small and dark, with bars on the window and a heavy wooden door. Elizabeth sat on the narrow cot and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Mary's betrayal was complete. She had exposed Elizabeth's heritage, ruined her reputation, and delivered her into Blackwood's hands more thoroughly than any capture could have done. But as Elizabeth sat in the darkness, she began to think. Mary had made one crucial mistake. She had revealed her hand too early. If Elizabeth could find a way to turn the tables to use Mary's own treachery against her, she might still have a chance. The door to the cell opened, and a young soldier entered. Elizabeth recognized him, John Carter, barely 18, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that set him apart from the other soldiers. "I brought you some food," he said quietly, setting a tray on the small table. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, studying his face. "You don't have to be kind to me. I'm sure you've heard what they're saying." "I've heard," Carter said. "But I've also seen how Judge Blackwood treats people. And I don't think it matters what blood runs in your veins, you're still a human being." Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. "You don't approve of the judge?" Carter glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "I've seen things," he said quietly. "Things that would make you sick. That Indian they captured, your friend. Blackwood's planning to make an example of him." "What do you mean?" "He's going to have him tortured before the execution." Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to break him, to make him confess to crimes he didn't commit. He's already started." Elizabeth felt her heart break. "Where is he?" "In the stockade. But Miss Morgan, there's something else. Something you need to know." "What?" Carter pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I found this in Miss Hutchinson's room. She was burning papers, but this one fell out of the fire." Elizabeth unfolded the paper and gasped. It was a letter in Mary's handwriting, but it wasn't addressed to her family. It was addressed to someone at the Continental Railroad Company, detailing plans for acquiring Cheyenne land and discussing payments for services rendered. Mary's not just working for Blackwood," Elizabeth breathed. "She's working for the railroad." "It gets worse," Carter said. "That letter mentions other operations, other women who've been discredited or eliminated to clear the way for land grabs. You're not the first, Miss Morgan. Elizabeth felt sick. The conspiracy was bigger than she had imagined, a systematic campaign to destroy anyone who might stand in the way of the railroad's westward expansion. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Carter's young face was grim. "Because someone needs to stop them. And because that Indian stone wolf, he saved my life once. I was on patrol, got lost in a blizzard. He found me, brought me back to the fort. Never said a word about it, but I knew who he was. What can we do?" "I don't know," Carter admitted. "But I'll help you if I can. You just need to tell me how." Elizabeth looked at the letter again, her mind racing. Mary had made a mistake, and now Elizabeth had proof of the conspiracy. But how could she use it? How could she save Stonewolf and expose the truth? And then she had an idea. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. "I need you to get a message to someone," she said. "Someone who can help us turn the tables on all of them." "Who?" "The newspaper editor in Denver. His name is William Hayes. He's been investigating corruption in the territorial government. If we can get this letter to him, along with my testimony about what really happened." Carter nodded slowly. "It might work. But what about Stonewolf? They're planning to execute him tomorrow." "Then we need to move fast," Elizabeth said. "And we need to be prepared for anything." The next morning, Elizabeth was escorted to the fort's courtyard, where a crowd had gathered for the execution. A gallows had been hastily constructed, and Stonewolf stood on the platform, his hands bound behind his back. He had been beaten, his face swollen and cut, but his eyes were still defiant. Blackwood stood beside the gallows, preparing to address the crowd. "Citizens of Wyoming territory," he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Today, we witness justice being served. This savage kidnapped and corrupted a white woman, and for that crime, he must pay with his life." Elizabeth pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. She had to time this perfectly, or they would all die. "Wait," she called out. "I have something to say." Blackwood's face darkened. "Miss Morgan, you are in no condition to—" "I'm in perfect condition to tell the truth." Elizabeth interrupted, pulling out the letter Carter had given her. "And the truth is that this man never kidnapped me. He saved my life." The crowd murmured, confused. Blackwood gestured to his soldiers, but Elizabeth was already climbing onto a crate so everyone could see her. "Judge Blackwood and his associates at the Continental Railroad Company orchestrated this entire charade." She continued, holding up the letter. "They wanted Cheyenne land for the railroad, and they used me as an excuse to get it." "She's lying." Mary's voice rang out from the crowd. "She's been driven mad by her captivity." Have I?" Elizabeth asked, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Then explain this letter, Mary. The one in your handwriting detailing payments from the railroad company for your services." Mary's face went pale. That's not... It's addressed to Continental Railroad, signed by you, and it details not just this operation, but others like it." Elizabeth continued. "How many other women have you destroyed? How many other innocent people have died for your 30 pieces of silver?" The crowd was growing restless now, murmuring among themselves. Elizabeth could see doubt creeping into their faces, anger beginning to replace their bloodlust. "Don't listen to her," Blackwood shouted. "She's a half-breed savage herself. She's corrupted by Indian blood." "Yes, I am," Elizabeth said proudly. "My grandmother was Cherokee, and I'm proud of that heritage. But that doesn't make me less human, and it doesn't make their lies true." She pulled out another paper, a copy of the letter that Carter had smuggled to Denver. This morning, the Denver Post received a full account of this conspiracy. By now, the territorial governor is reading about Judge Blackwood's corruption, about the railroad's illegal land, grabs about the innocent people who have died to feed their greed. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "Kill her!" he shouted to his soldiers. "Kill them both." But the soldiers hesitated. The crowd was turning ugly, and some of them were beginning to shout questions about the railroad conspiracy. Elizabeth could see the tide turning, could feel the moment when the truth would finally triumph. "You want to know the real truth?" she called out to the crowd. "Stone Wolf and his people are fighting to protect their children, their families, their way of life. They're not savages. They're patriots defending their homeland against invaders who would destroy everything they hold dear." A shot rang out, and Elizabeth felt a bullet whistle past her ear. Blackwood stood with a smoking pistol in his hand, his face twisted with rage. "Enough!" he screamed. "I won't be destroyed by a half-breed whore and her savage lover." He raised the pistol again, but this time it was Stone Wolf who moved. Despite his bound hands, he threw himself from the gallows platform, crashing into Blackwood and sending them both tumbling to the ground. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people were shouting for justice, others were calling for blood. Elizabeth jumped down from her crate and ran toward Stone Wolf, who was struggling to break free of his bonds. "Behind you." Carter's voice cut through the noise. Elizabeth turned to see Mary advancing on her with a knife, her face twisted with hatred. "You ruined everything," she screamed. "Everything I worked for." Elizabeth dodged the knife thrust, but Mary was faster than she looked. The blade caught Elizabeth's arm, opening a gash that immediately began to bleed. "You always had to be special." Mary snarled, raising the knife again. "Always had to be better than everyone else. Well, now you're going to die like the savage you are." But before Mary could strike again, a rifle shot echoed across the courtyard. Mary staggered, looking down at the spreading stain of blood on her dress, then collapsed to the ground. Carter lowered his smoking rifle, his young face grim. "She was going to kill you," he said simply. Elizabeth looked around the courtyard, trying to make sense of the chaos. Blackwood was on the ground, unconscious, or dead, she couldn't tell which. Stone Wolf was free of his bonds, standing over his fallen enemy. The crowd was dispersing, many of them, heading toward the telegraph office to send word to Denver about what they had witnessed. "Is it over?" Elizabeth asked, hardly daring to believe it. Stone Wolf took her in his arms, mindful of her wounded arm. "For now," he said. "But there will be others. The railroad won't give up easily. Then we'll face them together," Elizabeth said. "As we always have." Carter approached them, his rifle still in his hands. "Miss Morgan, you need to get that arm looked at. And you both need to get out of here. There are bound to be others who worked with Blackwood, and they won't be happy about this." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion. "What about you? You helped us. They'll come after you too." Carter smiled. "I'm a soldier, Miss Morgan. I swore an oath to protect the innocent and serve justice. Today I kept that oath." As they prepared to leave Fort Laramie, Elizabeth looked back at the scene of their triumph. Mary lay dead in the dirt, her dreams of revenge and wealth ended forever. Blackwood was being carried away on a stretcher, his political career destroyed, even if he survived his injuries. The conspiracy was exposed, and the truth was spreading, and justice was finally being served. But Elizabeth knew that this was just the beginning. The forces they had defeated were part of a larger system of corruption and greed that stretched across the entire territory. There would be other battles to fight, other injustices to expose, other people to save. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Stone Wolf asked her as they rode away from the fort. Elizabeth looked at the man she loved at the horizon, stretching endlessly before them, at the future they would build together. "I'm ready for anything," she said, "as long as we face it together." They rode north toward the Canadian border, where they would build a new life free from the reach of corrupt judges and railroad barons. Behind them, the truth was spreading like wildfire, inspiring others to stand up against injustice and fight for their own freedom. Elizabeth Morgan had run from a forced wedding to an old judge, and she had found love in the arms of a Cheyenne chief. But more than that, she had found herself a woman strong enough to stand up to corruption, brave enough to fight for justice. and wise enough to know that true freedom could only be won by those willing to sacrifice everything for it. The chains of oppression could be broken. The cages of convention could be opened. And love, true love, could conquer even the darkest forces of hatred and fear. Years later, when Elizabeth published her memoir, she would write, "Freedom is not a destination, but a journey. And the only way to travel it is with courage, love, and the unshakable belief that no one has the right to own another human being's soul." The story of Elizabeth Morgan and Stone Wolf became legend, inspiring generations of people to fight for their own freedom. Their love had not only survived the trials of prejudice and persecution, it had helped to change the world.